When I first moved into the neighborhood, the garden wasn't anything special. Just a small patch of soil, a few rows of flowers, and some hand-built wooden borders I'd made with leftover planks from a shed project. But over the next few years, it grew into something that drew people in. Neighbors walking their dogs would stop to admire the colors. Kids would point at the butterflies hovering above the daisies. And even the local paper once called it a little slice of paradise in suburbia. It wasn't a big deal to me. Gardening was just my peace. My job was stressful, my days long, and coming home to dig in the soil was my way of staying grounded. But peace doesn't last long in HOA neighborhoods. The trouble started when a new HOA president was elected. His name was Richard, but everyone quietly called him Rick the Ruler. He'd lived in the neighborhood for years, and from what I'd heard, he'd been campaigning for the position for just as long. The kind of man who measured lawns with a ruler, reported trash bins left out a minute too long, and bragged about maintaining property values. At first, I didn't think much of it. I kept my garden neat, stayed out of trouble, and followed the rules. But one morning, a bright orange notice appeared on my mailbox. The HOA had decided that my garden did not conform to the community's uniform landscaping standards. According to their letter, my mix of native wildflowers, herbs, and stone pathways disrupted the aesthetic consistency of the neighborhood. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe some new regulation had passed, or maybe they'd confused my address with someone else's. But when I called the HOA office, I was told the president himself had filed the complaint. Over the next few days, the situation escalated. More notices, fines, threats of corrective landscaping action. They gave me 2 weeks to restore my yard to compliance standards. That meant removing nearly everything, the flowers, the small pond, even the butterfly boxes. It wasn't just about the plants anymore. It was about control. Rick wanted to make an example out of me. He didn't like individuality. He wanted every house to look identical. The same manicured grass, the same trimmed hedges, the same soulless perfection. Neighbors quietly whispered their support, but no one wanted to get involved. Rick was notorious for retaliation. People who stood up to him found their applications denied, their fences measured, their mailboxes inspected for non-standard paint finishes. It was absurd, but that's how HOA bullies work. I tried to reason with him once, through a formal letter. I explained that my garden used native plants, required less water than lawns, and even helped the local bee population. I thought he might appreciate the eco-friendly approach. Instead, he doubled down. He claimed my wild landscaping could attract pests and lower property values. That's when I realized something. This wasn't about community rules. It was personal. Weeks went by, and the fines piled up. I refused to remove the garden, and the HOA started sending legal warnings. They threatened to hire a contractor to restore my yard and charge me for the costs. The tone of their letters became increasingly aggressive, and every one of them was signed by Rick himself. The breaking point came one Thursday morning. I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery outside my window. When I looked out, there it was, a small bulldozer parked in front of my house, an HOA contracted landscaper standing beside it with a clipboard. They were preparing to dig up my garden. No warning. No permission. No court order. Just pure arrogance. I stepped outside and stood between them and my garden. I didn't yell, I didn't argue. I simply refused to move. Eventually, they backed off, saying they'd return with authorization. But the message was clear. Rick wasn't bluffing. That night, I sat in my living room surrounded by the letters and notices, reading them one by one. Each line made my blood boil. The HOA had overstepped. That much was obvious, but I needed more than anger. I needed leverage. Something that would make them regret ever trying to mess with me. So I started researching. I read through the HOA's bylaws, county codes, zoning regulations, anything I could find. Hours turned into days, and the deeper I went, the more I realized how poorly the HOA understood its own rules. There were contradictions everywhere. Vague definitions. Unclear boundaries. But then I stumbled onto something that made my heart race. It was a small note buried deep within the city's environmental protection ordinances. A section about urban conservation designations. It allowed private homeowners to register parts of their property as protected habitats if they provided shelter and food sources for certain species of birds and pollinators. Once designated, that land couldn't be altered or destroyed. Not even by an HOA was the perfect loophole. All I needed was proof and paperwork. Lots of it. I started taking photos of every butterfly, bee, and bird that visited my garden. I documented the native plants, recorded soil data, and contacted a local conservation group for help. They were thrilled by the idea and offered to assist with the application. As I gathered evidence, I could almost feel the tide turning. Every flower I'd planted years ago had become my secret weapon. Every bee buzzing in the garden was now an ally in my quiet war. Meanwhile, the HOA didn't know what was coming. Rick continued to send threats and demands, but I stopped responding. I was too busy building my case and planning my revenge. By the end of the week, the application was ready. It was detailed, airtight, and backed by professional support. I submitted it to the city's Department of Environmental Conservation, and they told me the review process would take about a month. If approved, my garden, the very one the HOA wanted to destroy, would become legally untouchable. The waiting period was torture. Rick continued to pressure me, sending another warning that they'd initiate removal proceedings soon. But this time, I didn't flinch. I just smiled, knowing that soon, he'd be digging his own grave, metaphorically speaking. And sure enough, about 3 weeks later, an envelope arrived from the city. Thick paper, official seal, and a bold heading at the top: Protected Urban Wildlife Habitat Certification. I held the letter in my hands and laughed. I'd done it. My garden was now under state environmental protection. But I wasn't done yet. The next HOA meeting was coming up, and I planned to attend, not to defend myself, but to watch Rick's expression when he realized what I'd just done. He thought he was going to bulldoze my garden. Instead, he was about to bulldoze his own career as HOA president. The night of the HOA meeting felt electric, the kind of quiet tension that hums in the air right before a storm. The clubhouse was packed, more than I'd ever seen before. Usually, only a handful of residents showed up to these monthly sessions, but word had spread about the garden dispute. Everyone wanted to see what would happen when I finally faced off with Rick, the self-proclaimed defender of property values. He sat at the front of the room, surrounded by board members who looked more like reluctant followers than decision-makers. His polished suit, smug smile, and stack of printed violation notices screamed authority. But beneath that confidence, I could see the faint cracks, the kind that form when someone knows they might have overplayed their hand. The meeting started as they always did: a dull recitation of minutes, budget updates, and minor complaints about fence heights and trash schedules. Then, almost with theatrical flair, Rick cleared his throat and announced the next agenda item: non-compliance with community landscaping standards, addressed to the resident of Lot 47, also known as the Garden Matter. A murmur ran through the room. Everyone knew whose property that was. Mine. Rick started summarizing his version of the events: how I had willfully ignored repeated HOA communications, how my yard posed aesthetic inconsistencies, and how multiple neighbors had complained. He read every word as if it were gospel, flipping through printed photos of my yard as if he were presenting evidence in a courtroom. That I sat quietly near the back, waiting for him to finish. When he finally concluded, he looked up from his papers with that patronizing smile. The floor was open for discussion. A few residents half-heartedly nodded along, though most stayed silent. They'd seen how he operated. Anyone who crossed him usually found themselves targeted next. But this time I wasn't alone, and I wasn't defenseless. When I stood up, the room seemed to hold its breath. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply stated that I had new documentation that superseded everything the HOA had filed. Then, from a neatly organized folder, I produced the letter from the city, the official certification stamped with the Department of Environmental Conservation seal. I laid it flat on the meeting table and began to explain, calmly and clearly, what it meant. My garden, I said, was now a registered and protected urban wildlife habitat. That designation legally prohibited anyone, including the HOA, from altering, removing, or interfering with the space. It was no longer subject to community landscaping guidelines. In fact, any attempt to modify or destroy it could be considered a violation of state conservation law. subject to fines and legal action. The board members leaned forward, their faces shifting from confusion to disbelief. One of them asked to see the letter, and when she read the section about fines and penalties, her eyes widened. The room was silent except for the faint sound of paper rustling. Rick tried to regain control. He stammered something about verifying authenticity and potential misuse of terminology. But the damage was already done. The authority in his voice had vanished. The residents were whispering now, murmuring in support. Even those who'd once feared him were grinning behind their hands that I wasn't done. Though, I'd done my homework, and I knew how to make this hurt. I explained that under state environmental statutes, any organization or individual attempting to destroy or alter a designated wildlife habitat without approval could face daily fines, starting at $2,000 per day. The HOA's earlier threats, the bulldozer incident, even the letters, all of it now formed a paper trail of intent. I had kept every notice, every photo, every timestamp at a T that moment. Rick's face went pale that he tried to interrupt, but one of the board members, a woman who'd stayed quiet through most of his presentation, stopped him. She asked if I would be willing to provide copies of the documents for legal review. I agreed, of course, and added that the city had already scheduled an inspection of the area to confirm compliance and ensure no further interference would occur. That meant the HOA couldn't even step foot on my property without risking penalties. What came next was chaos. Residents started asking questions, not to me, but to Rick. How could he have approved a demolition without proper authorization? Why had the HOA spent community funds hiring a contractor without a vote? Wasn't that misuse of association resources? The same man who used to intimidate everyone now found himself cornered. His confident tone cracked under pressure. He blamed miscommunication, then procedure, then the landscaping committee. But no one bought it. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, and one finally suggested tabling the matter for legal review, which, in HOA language, meant they were backing away fast. I sat back down, the faintest hint of satisfaction rising in my chest. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about accountability. For years, Rick had used the HOA as his personal power trip, but now the rules he loved so much had turned against him. When the meeting adjourned, a few neighbors approached me quietly. Some thanked me for standing up. Others asked how I'd found the loophole. A few even said they planned to start their own native gardens now that they knew the HOA couldn't stop them. The ripple effect was immediate. Rick, meanwhile, avoided eye contact. He gathered his papers and stormed out, leaving the rest of the board to clean up the mess. His control was slipping, and everyone could see it. In the days that followed, things changed quickly. The HOA stopped sending me letters. The fines disappeared from my account. And soon, rumors began circulating, whispers that the board had received a notice from the city about their own violation. Apparently, someone, perhaps a very diligent homeowner, had submitted a report citing the HOA's attempted destruction of a protected habitat. The city had opened an investigation, and inspectors were scheduled to visit the neighborhood to review the HOA's conduct. When I saw the official truck parked near the clubhouse the following week, I couldn't help but smile. Rick wasn't seen much after that. His once daily patrols through the neighborhood stopped. The board meetings went quiet for a while, but I knew this wasn't over yet. Men like him don't give up easily. They find ways to fight back, even when they're cornered. And sure enough, a few weeks later, another letter appeared in my mailbox. This time not from the HOA, but from Rick himself. It wasn't a notice or a threat. It was a formal complaint filed with the city, alleging that I had falsified my wildlife certification. He claimed I'd staged my documentation, that my garden wasn't authentic, and that I'd misled government officials. He was trying to use my own victory against me. But what he didn't know was that his last move would be the one that finally destroyed him, and the HOA he'd built his little empire on. The complaint arrived like the last dying shot of a desperate man. Neatly typed, stamped with a date, and filled with the kind of smug confidence only someone like Rick could muster. He accused me of falsifying documentation, manipulating environmental law, and misleading city officials, all in a desperate attempt, he said, to undermine the integrity of the homeowners association. It was absurd but typical. After being humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood, he wanted one last chance to claw back control. What he didn't realize, though, was that by filing that complaint, he just dragged himself and the entire HOA into a legal spotlight they couldn't escape. The city took his claims seriously at first. They scheduled a follow-up inspection of my property to verify that my protected status was legitimate. I didn't panic. I knew the process inside out by now. I had documentation, time-stamped photographs, and written support from the conservation organization that helped me. On the day of the inspection, 2 city officials arrived with clipboards and cameras. They were polite but thorough, walking through the garden, taking soil samples, checking plant species. I answered every question calmly and provided every file they asked for. I could tell within minutes that they were impressed, not just with the paperwork, but with the garden itself. They confirmed that my property wasn't just compliant. It exceeded the state's requirements for an urban wildlife habitat. They even mentioned possibly featuring it in a community conservation program. And then came the moment that changed everything. While one of the inspectors reviewed my documents, the other casually mentioned they'd already been in contact with the HOA and that things didn't look good for them. Apparently, during their investigation into Rick's earlier attempt to bulldoze my yard, they discovered multiple procedural violations. The HOA had acted without permits, authorization, or a formal board vote. Even worse, they'd used HOA funds to hire a contractor for the demolition, funds that should have been approved in a public meeting. That alone was a serious misuse of community money. The inspectors didn't say much more, but their tones said enough. The city's attention was no longer on me. It was squarely on Rick. A few weeks later, the news broke quietly, spreading through the neighborhood like wildfire. The city had issued formal citations against the HOA for environmental interference and unauthorized land modification attempts. Each citation carried heavy fines, and together they totaled more than $20,000. Rick, as the acting president who had signed the demolition orders, was held personally responsible for part of it. The board had tried to protect him, but when the city's report came out, they couldn't ignore it anymore. The other members voted, unanimously, to remove him from his position. The man who once strutted through the streets, clipboard in hand, barking about lawn heights and mailbox colors, was gone in an instant. The neighborhood changed almost overnight. Without Rick's oppressive rules, people began reclaiming their spaces. Front yards that once looked like sterile museum exhibits started sprouting life. Flower beds, birdhouses, even small gardens inspired by mine. The air felt lighter, friendlier, like the whole place had been waiting for permission to breathe again. But my story with Rick wasn't quite finished. A month after his removal, I received a letter, handwritten, unsteady, and almost pitiful. It was from him. He didn't apologize outright. Men like him rarely do. But between the lines, it was clear that he'd lost everything that mattered to him. His reputation, his control, even the house he once boasted about. Rumor had it he sold it quietly and moved away, leaving behind a neighborhood that no longer cared to remember him. As for the HOA, the new board reached out to me personally. They wanted to make peace and, in an ironic twist, asked if I'd consider helping them draft new landscaping guidelines that allowed for eco-friendly designs. They even mentioned hosting an annual garden walk event to showcase sustainable yards. I agreed, but only after one condition: that they include a clause in the bylaws explicitly protecting any homeowner who chose to maintain native or wildlife-supporting plants. The motion passed unanimously. By the following spring, my once non-compliant garden had become the centerpiece of the neighborhood. Families walked through it on weekends. Children counted butterflies and bees for school projects. Even the local paper wrote another feature, this time calling it the garden that changed the HOA. Every now and then, when I stood by the flowers and watched the light dance across the petals, I thought about how close it all came to being destroyed. One man's ego almost erased years of care and beauty. But in the end, nature and persistence won. There was something poetic about it. Rick had wanted uniformity, control, perfection. But what truly brought value to the neighborhood wasn't sameness. It was individuality, growth, and resilience. I never sought revenge. I sought respect for what I'd built. But life has a way of balancing the scales on its own. Rick's downfall wasn't a result of my anger. It was a result of his own arrogance that as summer came, my garden bloomed brighter than ever. The bees hummed through the lavender, the fountain trickled softly, and a pair of sparrows had made a nest in the small tree by the fence. It was quiet, peaceful, exactly the way it had always been meant to be. And though I didn't need the validation, there was something deeply satisfying about seeing the HOA's new newsletter that month. On the front page, printed in large, bold letters, was an announcement for the first annual Community Wildlife Garden celebration.